It is our responsibility to develop what we call policy. And in essence, what that policy will do is ensure that everything is enforced the same way in Maine as it is in Nebraska, as it is in California. We do a lot of training, and needless to say, we've been doing a lot of internal and external training on the electronic logging device mandate that's come up. As Jessie mentioned, you know, the ELD has kind of shook the tree, and a lot of things that are hours of service issues have come to light, you know, in the context of the way people operate. But the electronic logging device mandate has made people think a lot more about their hours of service compliance. And so that is something that we are trying to address as well, by making sure that everybody does understand what they are responsible for, what they are subject to, and just how to comply better. So anyway, with that, I will go ahead and begin. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. The background of this, of course, is the 2012 Highway Reauthorization Bill, MAP 21, required that FMCSA develop a rule mandating the use of electronic logging devices. This was, of course, specific to ensure that people do not falsify their records of duty status. We published a final rule December 16, 2015, and Congress, as part of the reauthorization bill, did say, in essence, well, not in essence, but directly, you will enact this rule within 2 years of publication. So we did publish on 2015. That gave us 2 years to implement the rule. One thing that is very, very important to note is there were no changes made to the hours of service rules at all. The electronic logging device rule is a standalone rule. It did not affect any hours of service regulations whatsoever. So if you were subject before, you are still subject to the same hours of service rules. There's 4 major components of the rule. One is the requirements for the mandatory use of ELDs by most drivers currently required to prepare a record of duty status. I mean, generally, if you had to prepare a record of duty status, a logbook, previously, with some exceptions, you will have to have an ELD. That's kind of the general rule of thumb, but I will go over some exceptions. It also has minimum performance standards and design standards, technical specs for ELDs. It's required, it also included requirements for hours of service supporting documents, and also measurements to prevent harassment through the use of ELDs. So in other words, a company can't use an ELD to push a driver, to interrupt their rest time, et cetera, et cetera. And that was something that was mandated by Congress. Now, what is an ELD? An ELD automatically records a driver's driving time. It facilitates the accurate recording of the driver's hours of service, of course. It meets the minimum technical specifications of the rule, and that's in Appendix A to Subpart B of Part 395. It's integrally synchronized with the engine of the commercial motor vehicle. It must be registered with FMCSA, and it can transfer data electronically to safety officials. But in essence, since it is integrally synchronized to the engine, it can tell when you are moving and when you are not. And that is a huge part of ensuring compliance with the hours of service rules. Now, who's required to an ELD? This is probably something that is foremost on your mind. Interstate CMV drivers currently required to keep paper logs, as I mentioned before. So basically, if you're subject to Part 395, you're subject to the ELD rule. Now, what we're talking about here is drivers of commercial motor vehicles defined in the rules as being greater than 10,001 pounds, or carries placarded amounts of hazardous materials, or is designed to carry 8 or 15 passengers or more. The exemptions, and some of you might fall into these: 100 air mile radius drivers. This is a carryover from the hours of service rules. If you don't go beyond 100 air mile radius and your drivers have a workday that is 12 hours or less, they do not exceed 11 hours of driving in those 12 hours, then they just need to keep time records. They wouldn't need to have a logbook before. They don't need to have an ELD now. 150 air miles radius for non-CDL property carrying drivers. And I'll talk about CDL a little bit here, and we do have some questions on that. CDL, of course, is separate and distinct from the requirements of the electronic logging devices and the hours of service rules. The commercial driver's license regulations begin at 26,001 pounds. Straight trucks over 26,001 pounds. Combinations over 26,001 pounds where the trailer is over 10. That is really the key to the commercial driver's license, which also goes along with the drug and alcohol requirements. One is not dependent on the other. You can have a situation where you are subject to the hours of service rules, but you're not subject to the commercial driver's license regulations because you're not of sufficient weight, and vice versa. You could have a CDL not operate in interstate commerce and possibly not be subject to the hours of service rules, depending on what requirements the states have issued. But like I said, we got a couple questions on that, and I'll go over that a little bit more at the end. But in essence, we have CDL rules, we have hours of service rules. CDL rules are licensing rules that are set by the state. The state sometimes has regulations that are even more inclusive than what the federal regulations state for commercial driver's licenses. So just kind of wanted to lay that out. This exemption, the third one on this list, is one that we're finding a lot of agricultural folks fall into. If you're not required to prepare a paper rod for more than 8 days in any 30-day period, you're not subject to the ELD rules. You're still, of course, subject to the hours of service rules. But the way you think about this, consider every day that you're operating as your 30th day. So you can project ahead. So if today is day 30, say you've just got one driver that operates your large vehicles. You look at what he's done for the next week. You know that in the next couple days, he's going to have to exceed the 150 air miles, and I'll talk about that a little bit later about the agricultural exemption. But for whatever reason, if that driver, say he hadn't driven at all in the last 30 days, well, you know that the trip he's going to be on, he's going to have a logbook for 2 days before he returns. You're still in good shape because you projecting ahead, you know that he's never going to be in a position where he is exceeded needing a logbook for more than 8 times in the last 30 days. If a driver has operated quite a bit in the last 30 days, that might be a little bit different. But the bottom line is any individual driver that is not required to prepare a record of duty status more than 8 times in any 30-day period is subject to this exemption. Strictly has to comply with hours of service, but won't necessarily have to have an electronic logging device. A driver conducting driveway towaway operations in which the vehicle being driven is part of the shipment, or driving vehicles manufactured before model year 2000. And that also includes vehicles that have been retrofitted with older engines. So basically, if you have a 1999 engine or before, you're not going to be subject to electronic logging devices. You just need the best thing to do is to have some documentation or be able to point out to law enforcement folks, that information that would prove that the engine is older. And that was done because of the electronics, the connections to the electronic control module for the vehicles were not compatible. 90-day agricultural ELD waiver. A lot of you are probably following this. And in fact, I didn't update this slide. I thought I'd update. Oh, yes, I did. 90-day waiver was granted from 12/18 to March 18, 2018, and it was extended another 90 days until June 18, 2018. This is a waiver. So the waiver, covers agricultural operations until June 18, 2018. Now, this was to provide time for us to consider the use of ELDs in some agricultural sectors, and most importantly, to finalize some regulatory guidance. Because, I'll be honest with you, when the ELD rule, like I said, the ELD rule kind of shook the tree a little bit. There were a lot of folks that were not fully aware of this agricultural exemption and how it worked, and so we wanted to be sure that we had an opportunity to clarify. So we've been doing a lot of webinars like this, We've been making sure that our, excuse me, our field staff understands exactly what the exemption entails. And as a result of that, we did publish some proposed guidance to clarify, and I'll go over that a little bit more here in some future slides. But again, part of this waiver, it's strictly for the ELD, the requirement to have an ELD. It's not a waiver from the hours of service rules. Excuse me. Now, the conditions of this waiver are the same as they were through the 18th. It applies to transporters of agricultural commodities in 395(1)(k)(1) only, regardless of distance traveled, transporting agricultural commodities defined in 395.2, and I'll go over those as well. Again, can't stress this enough. Hours of service rules still apply, and all of the federal motor carrier safety regulations that go along with that. So anything, driver qualifications, insurance, et cetera, et cetera. To qualify for this, the carrier must have a satisfactory rating or be unrated. So if you're conditional or unsatisfactory, you cannot take advantage of this waiver. A copy of the Federal Register notice must be in the vehicle. That's the way, to be sure that your driver and the enforcement folks have that in their hands. They can, if they're not familiar with it, they can look at that and know what the definition is, and if you fall under it. And of course, carriers subject to the waiver must provide a crash notification to FMCSA within 5 days. Now, the definition I mentioned, 395(1)(k)(1), what is an agricultural operation? The provisions of this part are not applied during planting and harvesting periods as determined by each state to drivers transporting agricultural commodities within the source, from the source to a location within 150 air mile radius from the source. And basically the source is the origin of the product. If you've got a stockyard, that would be the source. It wouldn't be a secondary location point. It would be the source of the commodity itself. One thing that's a real key in this as well, to this first part of this, it is determined by the state. The state does make the determination when the planting and harvesting periods, and it is, again, up to the state. There are some states that have never made this designation, and of course that makes it virtually impossible to use this exemption. This is something the state has to do, but most states have well-defined planting and harvesting periods, and of course the law enforcement community is well aware of those. Now, what is an agricultural commodity? An agricultural commodity, non-processed food, feed, fiber, or livestock. That's, of course, what you all are going to be carrying the most of. But that's basically it. It's the unprocessed things. It is the, the raw stuff, I guess I should say. Anything, once it has been processed into something else, it's no longer an agricultural commodity. This is, of course, a congressional mandate for this 150 air mile radius. It was something that was done legislatively that we now currently enforce. But again, agricultural commodity is non-processed food, feed, fiber, or livestock. Now, the proposed regulatory guidance. This is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. Now, our goal, we put this out and the comment period is closed, but you still are free to comment, because as long as we have not finalized it, we'll try to get everybody's comments in. The comments were due back in February, and of course the link is you see. Again, the exemptions were based on the statute. Some of the issues that we're trying to cover are unladen versus laden, trips beyond 150 air mile radius, and the source of commodities versus multiple sources. Because again, the key to the agricultural exemption is, in essence, if you meet this definition of agricultural transportation and agricultural commodity, anytime within the first 150 air miles of the source basically doesn't count for anything. You're completely exempt from the hours of service rules, completely. So if you stay within that time, you'd never have to have a logbook. and if you never exceed that, you would never have to have an ELD. If you go beyond the 150 air miles, at that point is when your hours of service would begin. That's when your 11 and 14 would start. So those days would count as having to have a logbook. So if you exceed that more than 8 times in any 30-day period, then you could possibly be subject to the ELD rule. But again, what we're trying to clarify is some of these issues, laden versus unladen, exactly some of the details on the trips beyond 150 air mile radius, and the source of commodities versus multiple sources. Give you a scenario, and this is right out of the proposed guidance. Does the agricultural exemption apply to drivers where, excuse me, excuse me for a moment. Does the agricultural exemption apply to drivers while driving unloaded to a source where an agricultural commodity will be loaded into an unloaded return trip after delivering an agricultural commodity under the exemption? Again, this is not the way the guidance reads now. This is proposed guidance. The proposed guidance would be yes, provided the trip does not include transporting other products and the sole purpose is to deliver agricultural commodities defined in 395.2. And of course, I gave you that definition before. But that is the proposed guidance. That was one of the areas where we thought that we needed some clarification. The second scenario, and again, this is right out of the regulatory proposal that was published in the Federal Register. Does the agricultural commodity exemption apply if the destination for the commodity is beyond the 150 air mile radius from the source? The proposed guidance would be the exception applies to transportation during the initial 150 air miles from the source. Hours of service time begins beyond the 150 mile threshold until they get back within the 150 air mile radius if returning to the original source. If not returning to the original source, hours of service continue to apply. So this is trying to clarify what happens if you return. You know, right now, anything within that 150 air miles, even if it takes you 6 hours to get there, if you're in a real mountainous area or something along those lines, until you get beyond that 150 air miles, that time does not count. Your hours of service does not start until you get beyond that 150 air mile radius. Now, the ELD rule implementation timeline, we're implementing this in 3 phases. We're well past phase 1, which was the awareness and transition phase, which is voluntary use of ELDs. Now, beginning 12/18/2017, mandatory use of ELDs, or if you had an automated onboard recording device, you're grandfathered for 2 years. So any of you that might have an AOBRD that was installed and in use on a vehicle before December 18th, you can continue to use that until 12/16/2019. But after 2019, everything has to be ELDs. Now, for some information on the website, we do have quite a bit of information on the website. In fact, we have a quite robust agricultural area now. That was something that we developed here in the past couple of weeks because we did realize that there were a lot of folks asking quite a few questions about the agriculture. We realized we maybe didn't have as much information up there as we needed. But again, if you check out our website, we do have a lot of agricultural information that will help walk you through different scenarios. We've got scenarios up there that relate to the non-business use, you know, for rodeos and things of that nature. And there's a couple questions that I'll cover before we open it up as well. But I do encourage you all to take a look at that information. If you have questions, in addition to calling someone like myself, you can send a inquiry to our ELD mailbox. We do have several people working on that, but I will be honest with you, we get hundreds a day. So it might take a few days for us to get back to you, but that is an availability. If you really want to have something in writing, that is a way to do it. We do have a special category for law enforcement personnel. We have dozens of frequently asked questions, a lot of them that are covering agricultural issues. And I'll be honest with you, 95% of the questions that we probably get through the mailbox are covered by the Q's and A's. So I definitely encourage you to look at the Q's and A's. They are segregated by topic. You know, there's things about, there's an agricultural section, et cetera, et cetera. So I do encourage you to take a look at those. We do have a list of registered and or revoked ELDs. Right now, we don't have any revoked ELDs, but we do have over 300 that are registered. In order for something to be an electronic logging device, it does have to be on this list. That means it has been properly registered with us and it's gone through a protocol. Harassment complaints, you know, as I'd mentioned earlier, that was something that Congress made sure that we did cover. If a driver does feel like they are being harassed as a result of their ELD use, we do have a specific National Consumer Complaint Database where those complaints can be filed and they will be addressed. Now, the conclusion, during phase 2, which is what we're in, carriers can use grandfathered EOBRDs, electronic logging devices. Of course, this phase began last December. We also have a lot of training available on the website. We have webinars that have been recorded. We've got presentations. We also encourage you to contact our local Federal Motor Carrier office in your state because they have presentations and they are ready, willing, and able to provide additional training as needed. And also, I did mention earlier that we do what we basically do in my division is make policy. Once we make policy, it goes into what we call the Electronic Field Operations Training Manual. And that is the core of what our folks out in the field use. You know, to make sure that they are doing it the same way all around the country, we have this extensive training manual, and it's on our website. There's very little redacted, only things that could be used for bad purposes, but I think you'd be very surprised at how little we redact. Our basic philosophy is transparency. We want to make sure that you know what you're expected to comply with. So you, in essence, get to see what our enforcement people see. That is in our electronic reading room, and I certainly do encourage you all to look at that. It is updated quarterly. But with that, let me go over a few questions that came in, and hopefully I've covered some of these, but let me see. One of the questions was, is loading and unloading time at a ranch, feed yard, packing plant, etc., counted as part of your on-duty time? The answer to that is yes, if it's beyond the 150 air miles. If you're within that 150 air miles, then it will not count. Again, the 150 air mile radius, as long as you're within that, if you're on a legitimate fall within that waiver, none of that time will count. If it's beyond it, yes, that would count as on duty, not driving time. For purposes of the 150 air mile exemption, what constitutes a source? I think I covered that a little bit earlier. You know, it's the origin of the you know, for example, for you all, it would be a stockyard or a dairy or something like that, wherever the origin point for that trip was. Here's a question about the technology itself. How will the device, meaning an ELD, account for the 150 air mile exemption? There's a couple ways that can be done, actually more than a couple. One of the ways is some of the vendors are, from what I've heard from them, they are creating categories for exemptions, and that is perfectly acceptable. The other way to do it is two ways. The driver can just not turn on the ELD until they get beyond the 150 air mile radius. That's perfectly acceptable. The other would be to turn the device on when you load, and then once you get past the 150 air mile radius, the time can be annotated. There is a way to annotate, in other words, explain that this last 150 air miles was done under the agricultural exemption. So if you are stopped, that will be noted in there. If you are ever audited, it will be noted in there by the driver, and it will be noted that it was, that time basically does not count. So there are some different ways to do that. But that's something, if you do feel like you're going to be subject to the ELD rule, it's something you might want to ask your vendor, because some of the vendors have even come up with GPS things for geofencing that would enact at 150 air miles and just automatically change the duty status at that point. But there's a lot of different ways to do that. Another one is, if my vehicle lists my business name, do I need an ELD? What if my vehicle is painted with a not for hire sign? This is one of those situations where those things really don't matter. It depends on what you're doing. If you are, quote, in commerce, then you are subject to the hours of service rules if you're in a vehicle over 10,000 pounds in interstate commerce, or if the state requires it. So it's really your use as opposed to how you're marked. Even not for hire, anything of that nature. It's the actual use of the vehicle. Now, again, keep in mind, 150 air mile radius applies. You know, whether if you are under a legitimate agricultural exemption, then that time wouldn't count. You're still, quote, subject to the rules. You're just operating under a waiver for those 150 air miles. But again, it's the use of the vehicle. Does the 8-day within a 30-day period exemption apply to livestock haulers traveling interstate beyond their 150 air mile radius? Yes, that is exactly what it is. If you're within the 150 air miles, you wouldn't need a logbook, you wouldn't need an ELD, you wouldn't need anything for hours of service. When you go beyond that 150 air miles, that's when you would have to start recording your hours on a paper log. Now, if you do that more than 8 times in any 30-day period, then you would be subject to the ELD rule. One of the things from talking to a lot of the folks in Phoenix and talking to some of the folks in Texas, if you have multiple drivers, you can manage that possibly. If you've got 3 or 4 drivers, you can spread them out. That's what you could do to avoid the possibility of having to have an ELD. The bottom line is, as long as you don't send out a driver that is operated more than 8 times in a 30-day period where they would require a logbook. So it's something that can be managed if you're right on the edge. If you do this as a matter of course, then you would need to have an ELD. The next question after that was, the answer changed if the trip happens more than 9 days in a 30-day period, and the answer is yes. And again, it's that 9th day that makes the ELD rule kick in, and you would have to have an ELD on your vehicle until your time caught up to you. If you only did that once, in essence, you'd need the ELD one time. But then once you moved ahead in days and you no longer were in a position where you had 9 times in the last 30 days, you would no longer need an ELD at that point. Another question on hours of service. How should livestock transporters respond if they fall short of their destination but have exceeded their driving limit for the day? Now, again, that situation is probably going to come up if you're beyond 150 air miles, because if you're within the 150, that time doesn't count. But say you do go beyond the 150 air miles, if you go 11 hours beyond that, and say you're 15 minutes from your destination, technically it is a violation. I'd be lying to you if I said it wasn't. It is a violation of that. Certainly we understand you've got livestock and that type of thing, but again, it is a violation because of the precise nature of the electronic logging device. We do have a thing called nominal violations. So anything less than 15 minutes is counted less than a regular hours of service violation. But again, it is still an hours of service violation. But, I obviously understand there are times where you would have to do that, for the safety and security of your load. But again, it is a violation. The other question, if I fall under the category of a covered farm vehicle, do I still need to install an ELD? Is my vehicle exempt if it's farm plated? Now again, the plates really don't matter. It's the use of the vehicle. The definition of covered farm vehicle is a little bit different. That is for, basically private farms. There is a specific definition for that. That is a much broader exemption than the one that I had mentioned. If you fall under the definition of a covered farm vehicle and you're under 26,001 pounds, you can basically go anywhere in the country and you're not subject to the hours of service rules at all. If you're over 26,001 pounds, which I'm assuming most of you are, then you would be exempt for everything under 150 air miles. So again, if you're under 26,001, you can go anywhere in the country, would never even need a logbook. But if you are a larger vehicle, it's basically the same as 150 air mile radius exemption for agricultural commodities. But again, the same 8 and 30 applies. If you only do that every once in a while, logbooks are sufficient. Wouldn't need an ELD unless you go beyond 8 and 30. Another question, if I'm required to obtain a CDL, am I also required to install an ELD? Can you explain the difference, including when a driver may need a CDL but not an ELD or vice versa? I did cover that a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth repeating because this is something that has caused some confusion. Again, for the interstate rules, which include the hours of service, that is also driver qualifications, that's insurance, those types of things, maintenance records, 10,001 pounds or combination over 10,001 pounds. Interstate commerce, you are subject to the rules. Most states have adopted them as well, but 10,000 pounds is the limit for the safety regulations. Commercial driver's license, again, it's 26,001. It's larger vehicles. Straight trucks over 26,001 or combination over 26,001 or 26,001 or more when the trailer is over 10. That is what kicks in the commercial driver's license scenario. And that is something you'd want to check with your individual state on because the state does issue the commercial driver's license. That may also get you into the drug and alcohol testing requirements as well as far as CDL. And of course, I've had a lot of questions on when that kicked in. The commercial driver's license regs have been in effect since they went fully into effect April 1st, 1992. So they have been around a while. And of course, the hours of service regulations have been around since about 1935. They were changed fairly extensively for property carriers back in 2005. And that's something I've been asked quite a bit about here lately also. But anyway, one really doesn't depend on the other. If you're driving a very large vehicle in interstate commerce and require a CDL, you're going to be subject to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, including the hours of service in all likelihood, but try to keep those separate in your mind. One, you certainly could have a CDL, never leave the state, and possibly not be subject to the safety regulations. But again, the states mostly have adopted the regulations for intrastate as well, but you wouldn't be subject from a federal standpoint. Let's see. I have a customer that's 240 miles from my home base, as well as several that range from 150 and 170 miles from load destination. We haul 3 to 5 days per month. Do I need an ELD? Possibly not. That situation, again, as long as you don't exceed 8 and 30, you're probably okay. If you're going 3 or 4 times a month on a consistent basis, at the same time every month, you're probably not going to need to have an ELD. But that is something you need to be mindful of. If things change, you want to make sure you're not caught short as you're out on the road during that 1 or 2 times when you might need an ELD. But again, this is something that for scheduling, if you've got more than one driver, it's something that you could possibly manage well. But again, if you're talking 3 to 5 days per month, take the biggest thing. Say you do 5 days at 5 days in a row at the end of a month. Right at the beginning of the next month, you've got to go 5 times again. Well, that's probably going to get you. Something like that. If you go 10 days in a row you're clearly going to be within, you're not going to be able to take advantage of the 8 and 30 exemption. But again, consider your day today is your last day of your 30-day period every day, and then look ahead at what you're planning and make sure that at no point in there as you count backwards from 30, from 230, that it never exceeds 8, and you should be all right. But again, it's individual. It's whatever you have to do. You just have to kind of keep a watch on it, count well, and spread out your loads. Next question. I haul livestock beyond 150 air miles, but only for a few days each month, less than 8. Am I exempt? I mean, that's basically the same question. Again, it's 8 and 30. Always look at how long your next trip is going to be, if they're going to need logbooks for every day of that trip, and how many trips they have taken within the last few days to make sure you don't exceed 8 and 30. Number 12, I'll be transporting horses in a trailer above 10,000 pounds to rodeos or similar events with a drive time of less than 11 consecutive hours, but traveling outside of the 150 air mile radius. These events will be for selling horses and or winning prize money. Do I need an ELD? The key to that is it part of your underlying business? For example, if your business is to sell horses and part of what you're doing there is to showcase your horses, that's part of your underlying business. I would say that would probably be a situation where if you didn't fall under one of the exemptions, for example, if you're within a 100 air mile radius, you wouldn't need a logbook anyway. But if you're within 150 and it's an agricultural movement, that would still be all right. But the key is it for a business purpose? For example, if your normal business is cattle, if it's cows, it's dairy, but on the weekends, you and your kids or your family go rodeoing, even if you get prize money, that's not part of your underlying business. That is just, a rodeo. That's really kind of a personal thing. And in that circumstance, that would really be just a personal use of a vehicle. It would not be business related, and you wouldn't be subject to anything except for whatever the state laws are for licensing and things of that nature. But again, the key is there an underlying business that you are supporting with that? That is something that has come up quite a bit. We're trying to make sure that everybody is well aware of what constitutes business versus non-business. And it certainly would help if you are out on the road, if you ever do get pulled over. That is something, those are the terms that you should use. Say, officer, this is for a non-business purpose. You can see on my vehicle, I'm a livestock guy. This is just going to a rodeo. Doesn't have anything to do with my business. I do this for fun. The more information you can get in your driver's hands that can explain either the exemption that you fall under or the fact that you're not operating in business at that point in time will always help you out quite a bit. Let's see, same scenario as above, but only travel for 4 and 30 days. It's really kind of the same thing. If you're non-business, you're non-business, and it's not going to count. If it is supporting an underlying business, then you have to take a look at your 8 and 30 or your 100 air mile radius or some of the other reasons why you might not have to have an electronic logging device or even fill out a paper logbook. Another question, are personal RVs exempt? How about trailers used occasionally to transport equine or other livestock, but with living quarters? Are these RVs exempt? An RV operated as a recreational vehicle, not in business, is not subject to any of the safety regulations at all or the commercial driver's license unless the state says that you have to. So really, try not to think of the configuration of the vehicle so much as the use of the vehicle. If it's an RV that is towing a trailer, combination, well over 10,000 pounds, it's clearly to move that cattle or livestock, then it's going to be for a business purpose. Then you fall back to, am I 8 and 30? Am I within the 100 air mile radius, etc. But again, if it's a non-business purpose, if say you're taking this to the rodeo, it's not part of your business. It's not supporting your underlying business. You're taking the RV with the living quarters, carrying the horses, or you go into 4-H, you know, something like that, would not count. But again, it's the use of the vehicle. Jessie, I think that was all the questions that I had that were sent in advance. So I'd be happy to answer any additional questions anybody might have.
Great, we've had a few that have come in. The first one is from Mike Brown. How does the ELD apply to ag equipment dealers?
Ag equipment dealers, I don't think they're going to fall under, because they're not transporting an agricultural commodity.
Okay. So, second one that's come in from Cody Lightwine. Does the ag exemption apply to those hauling wet cake, dry distillers, and other ethanol byproducts that are being hauled from the ethanol plant to the feed yard where it will be fed?
That I don't think would, because it sounds like it has been processed.
Okay.
Because really the key is the non-processed things.
Okay. Linda Smith, she says, how will government know if it is the same driver in the truck with the ELD? She's referring to a backup driver.
Okay, each part of the rule is each driver's got to have an individual login, and that is something that the company is required to do. It certainly is to the benefit of the company to switch the drivers. If one driver is not logging off and letting the other one use their code, they're probably going to run out of hours a lot faster. But it would be a violation to not switch. But each driver would have, by regulation, a individual login.
Okay. She's got a second part to her question. Does planting and harvesting have anything to do with livestock? So I think is livestock covered under planting and harvesting?
Yeah, livestock is definitely covered as part of the definition in 395.2, you know, which is agricultural commodity. And it's, if you recall, that was back on, let me pull it back up here. Whoops. There we go. Agricultural commodity means any agricultural commodity, non-processed food, feed, fiber, livestock, including livestock, is defined in blah, blah, blah of the USDA. So yes.
Great. Jeremy Rowe, he asks, if we run out of hours before we get to our destination with a load of cattle and continue on to our destination anyway, what is the penalty if we are over 15 minutes?
Well, you know, the fines themselves at the roadside are really up to the state. We do have penalties if we do catch you, you know, after the fact, you know, during an audit or that type of thing. The danger you run into when you're out on the road, you know, in that kind of a situation is you could possibly be placed out of service for 10 hours. Once you've exceeded the maximum driving time, the hours, the out of service criteria of the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance kicks in, and the penalty is basically being put out of service for 10 hours. So that's why having multiple drivers, you know, if you've got a team, or making sure that you plan your routes very carefully, that's why that's just so critical.
Okay, great. And just a reminder to everyone on here, if you have a question that you want to ask, click on the chat button located on the bottom of the screen, which will pull up your chat box and you can ask it there. Our next one from Scott Hartman. If I'm 1,000 miles from home, do I get the first 150 miles free from the ELD?
If you're from home,
if I'm 1,000 miles from home, do I get the first 150 miles free from the ELD?
It really depends. One of the things is if you are transporting from another source, if you're transporting another agricultural commodity that meets the definition, coming back, then yes, that first 150 miles would not count.
Okay. Alan Gross says, how will an officer determine if you are operating in business or a hobby? And he's referring to transporting horses to a rodeo, etc.
That's where my my discussion about making sure that your drivers understand exactly what you're doing, can explain it well. Because again, you know, the officers, we're trying to, you know, when we train our officers, we train them, you know, to look for non-business and things of that nature, the better that your drivers can articulate exactly what you're doing. So I would say, just like the scenario I had is, officer, I'm operating non-business right now. This has nothing to do with my cattle farm. I am just going to a rodeo. This is my personal use of this vehicle. I can't say that's going to work perfectly every time, but the more your driver or you can articulate exactly what you're doing, the stronger position you're going to be in. If you do feel like you've been cited incorrectly, we do have a process called our data queues where you can contest a violation. But again, can't stress it enough. The more your drivers know about exactly what you're doing, what exemption you fall under at the time, or whether or not you're business versus non-business, you're going to be miles ahead.
Okay, great. Bo Klug has asked, what is the reasoning behind the 150 air mile radius? Why isn't it larger, like 300 miles?
Well, this was a legislative thing. I mean, Congress basically, we had it as 100 miles a few years back. Congress extended it to 150. So it's legislative.
Okay. Wyatt Server.
And again, we did mention earlier in one of the questions, covered farm vehicles that are under 26,001 pounds don't have that 150 air mile radius. They can operate basically anywhere in the country if they meet that definition without any hours of service regulations at all.
Okay, great. Wyatt Server asks he says, so the 150 mile exemption applies each time you load at a new source, regardless of the location of that source. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes, as long as it continues to meet all the definitions of an agricultural movement, of an agricultural commodity, yes.
Okay. There's been some confusion. So is livestock exempt in Nebraska under the planting and harvesting rule? Could you go through that again, how the planting and harvesting rule impacts?
Okay, basically, let me take a step back here. For it to be an agricultural operation, the provision of this part should not apply during planting and harvesting periods as determined by each state to drivers transporting agricultural commodities. Livestock is certainly an agricultural commodity. What you'd want to do is check with your state, make sure that there's not some, I cannot imagine that this would be the case, but I can't speak for the state itself. A lot of states say, you know what, all year. Our planting and harvesting periods are all year.
We're one of those states.
But that is something you'd have to check with the state, just to be sure.
Sure. But they still, even if you're in a year-round planting and harvesting season, like a state like Nebraska, you still have to comply with the ELD. Is that an hours of service?
Right. As long as, because the only thing is if the state, because, there is one state that I know of that has never designated any kind of a planting or harvesting period, and therefore, that would be very difficult for anybody to argue that there is an agricultural exemption in that particular state. But that is the big exception. So a state, generally the planting and harvesting seasons are set by the state. If even with that, it's during those times where you have the 150 air mile radius exemption.
Okay, so just to clarify to everybody that we do have a year-round planting and harvesting period in Nebraska, which means which means basically that you get the 150 air mile radius exemption all year round. Whereas if we would have only have it from March to December per se, then in January and February you wouldn't get the exemption. But thankfully we've got it year-round here. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if that's the case, that would not surprise me a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and you all would know better. That's definitely your bailiwick.
Great.
And I would assume that would be the case.
So Alan Gross has asked, why was a 1-ton pickup legal in 1986 when 26,000 pounds was adopted, but the same pickup and trailer is not in compliance today? Why hasn't 26,000 went up with the GVWR of the same pickup?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one for me?
Sure. why was a 1-ton pickup legal in 1986 when the 26,000-pound rule, I think he means, was adopted, but the same pickup and trailer is not in compliance today? So he is asking, why hasn't a 26,000 went up with the GVWR of the same pickup?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. I mean, the commercial driver's license regs did go into effect as a result of the Act of '86, went into effect in '92. Anything over 10,000 pounds since basically 1935 has had to follow the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. So I'm not really sure. I mean, obviously, if you were between 10,000 and 26,000 pounds in 1986, yeah, you wouldn't have had to have a CDL at that point until April 1st of '92.
Okay. So
I'm not sure I'm answering the question.
Maybe we'll clarify with Alan afterwards what his question is, and then we'll correspond.
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
We'll get Alan an answer after the webinar. So Bo Klug has asked, when a driver does go over hours of service and gets shut down by DOT with livestock on the trailer, is the driver allowed to unload the livestock at a suitable facility and not sit at the side of the road?
That's really up to the law enforcement officer. That is certainly something that's within their discretion to do, meaning the officer. That's a time where, I would say work with the officer and say, look, I know, within a mile here, I've got a place where I can safely unload. That's where interaction and knowledge would really help you.
Okay. Well, if anyone else has a question, we have about 6 minutes left. Chat as quickly as you can in the Zoom group chat. Otherwise, Bill, I want to thank you again for doing this with our members. We greatly, greatly appreciate this. And if we get some follow-up questions from folks that weren't able to ask their questions here, would it be all right if we email those to you to get some clarification for some folks?
Absolutely, be happy to do that. And again, just one last thing, I would encourage everybody to take a look at our website. We do have right on our homepage, there's a big link to the agricultural information, and I definitely encourage everybody to take advantage of all the information that is there. It does talk a lot, we have a lot of specifics in there about some of these scenarios that people have brought up regarding rodeos and non-business use, so I think you could find them pretty helpful. But yes, I'm happy to answer additional questions if you send them to me.
Fantastic. So, Bill, thank you again for participating in our ELD webinar. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for being on. Benita has been recording this webinar, so we can make that available to you afterwards. Oh, I've gotten one more question that has come in, Bill. One more under the gun.
All right.
Okay, Jeremy Rowe says, what if no suitable facility is available to unload your livestock when you're over hours of service?
I mean, then you're just put out of service for 10 hours. And again, I can't stress enough, that's why the timing, and if you can use multiple drivers, if, good scheduling, good planning. I mean, to me, the best way to avoid that is to avoid being in that kind of position. Do be aware, though, we do have some provisions for bad weather, unexplained events, and things of that nature that can buy you another couple hours. So if you do get hit with something that is unexpected or unexplained, natural catastrophes, horrible weather, unexpected delays, there are regulations that can cover that. But something that is a regular route, I would say just plan well, make sure that you've got it covered so you don't get into that position.
Okay. Well, Bill, I think that's the extent of our questions in our webinar. So thank you again. And everyone, we'll have this available. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to always call me, Jessie Herrmann at Nebraska Cattlemen, and we'll continue getting this information out to everybody. So thank you all for attending, and thank you, Bill.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I really do appreciate you taking the time to listen to me.
Thanks, Bill.